Hello, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the National Humanities Center Humanities in Class webinar series. Tonight's session with Jesse Constantino from the University of New Mexico is titled The Graphic Novel, and we're anxious to work with you on both the sort of the scholarly and content side of the ways that graphic novel can be a powerful part of your curriculum and your teaching, but also engage you in a conversation around the pedagogical use of the graphic novel. My name is Andy Mink, and I'm the Vice President of Education at the Center. I'm at my home in Chapel Hill, North Carolina. The center is located just between Chapel Hill and Durham. My colleague Libby Taylor, who is instrumental in making sure that our webinar series is put together well and works as seamlessly as possible, is just down the road in Raleigh. And Jesse, I think, is joining us from New Mexico tonight. So, you know, in some ways, you can sort of get a sense that the technology has allowed us to bring together voices and educators from all over the country. And as I look through the attendance and the roster tonight, I'm pleased to see so many familiar names, folks who have joined us many different webinars over time, but also some new names and faces. And we would certainly encourage you to come back and join us for future sessions that we've got scheduled this year. Tonight's webinar is going to work as a audio and text-based format. I think you'll find that Jess and I are going to be somewhat extemporaneous in the conversation. While there's a linear PowerPoint that will drive and give you associated materials with tonight's session, a lot of this is going to be conversation, and that conversation is going to rely on your participation. In the lower right-hand corner of the navigation panel, you'll see a chat box, and I would encourage you not only to introduce yourself and share where you're from now, as I'm giving the opening remarks, but also throughout tonight's session, please ask questions, register thoughts, give us your best practices, tell us about some times that you've used graphic novels and particular titles you'd like to suggest in your own classroom, make connections with each other. You can both chat to the all audience, in which case we will all see that, or you can choose individual people to have a private conversation with. If you have any kind of problems tonight, you can always find my name or Libby Taylor's name and shoot us a private message, and we'll be happy to sort of work with you behind the scenes to resolve the problem. This is also a way, I think, for you to tell us the way that you might use these kinds of materials in your classroom, and again, we'd be very anxious to get that kind of feedback from you. We are going to make sure that your microphone is muted, and we will be recording tonight's session, so you'll have access to it later on, so you can go back and maybe linger on some of the key points, and again, match it up with the materials and the associated PowerPoint that we provide as well. The National Humanities Center really works hard, I think, to provide this kind of environment that is a conversation that advances the use of the humanities to make sense of the world that we live in. Each year we get an annual fellowship cohort of about 35 to 40 university professors who come to Durham, and they do their good work in the humanities. As a matter of fact, one of last year's fellows, Kate Marshall from Notre Dame, introduced me to Jesse, and I immediately got him signed up for this year's webinar series. But I think we also want to invite other voices into that conversation, and from my perspective, the expertise and the experience of you as educators is a critical part of what we do in the education work at the Humanities Center. It's your expertise that connects us directly with the classroom. It's your expertise and experience that left standing in front of kids probably just a few hours ago, maybe just a few moments ago if you're out on the West Coast. And we want to make sure that all of what we do is relevant and applicable, and we find ways to integrate your thoughts and your perspectives in this particular work. This work is represented in a variety of ways. That includes our America in Class lessons and resources. These instructional materials are meant to be both aspirational and practical, meaning some of them may just be really strong exemplars of instructional ways to approach different topics in the humanities. But my guess is most of you will take them and be inspired to do something else, to modify, to differentiate, to find ways to make it work well in your own unique classroom and for that own unique set of students. And so we would encourage you to go and visit this. All materials are free and easily accessible. They're downloadable, and if you do choose to use them or you do find them to be particularly relevant, we'd love to hear from you how you use them. Our webinar series is intended to extend that conversation one step further, and as you'll find tonight, it's a way for you to interact directly with scholars and leading experts in a variety of topics and themes. I think you'll find from this year's webinar series that we've really tried to address some relevant contemporary topics, things that may or may not fit in your curriculum, but the truth is you're still having these conversations with your students and with your kids as they walk in your classroom, as you meet with them in the hallway, as you see them in a variety of contexts. And what we want to do is give that scholarly lens to allow you to navigate those difficult topics a little bit more confidently. So I would encourage you to go to our webinar series. We've got the link here on the webpage. You can also go to nationalhumanitiescenter.org and find our webinars. We are finding that many of them are selling out this year, so I would encourage you to go in and sign up for those that you think are of the most interest to you. We have a Teachers Advisory Council that is comprised of 14 just fantastic educators from all over the country. As you'll see from the list of names and from their location, we've really drawn from a rich and diverse geographic background. We've got teachers of many different grade levels. We've got folks of different disciplines, and we've asked them to contribute to our work in a variety of ways. If you are interested in serving on the Teachers Advisory Council in the 2018-19 school year, we'll be issuing a call for applicants in the spring. We typically choose our next cohort by early summer, June-ish or so, and then we like to start our year with a 2-day retreat in Durham to really give you an immersive opportunity to look at and work with the center in all the ways that we work in the humanities. So all that's just a very brief introduction. The documentation for tonight will be provided to you after tonight's session, so I would encourage you to not only stay active and engaged at the beginning, but stay till the end. You'll receive a survey, and that survey will then issue you a certification that you can take to your administration and provide documentation that you participated tonight. We are finding, by the way, that some schools and school districts have a very rigorous firewall. And so when the GoToMeeting mass email sends you your certificate, sometimes it's getting held up in the filter. So if you don't get it within an hour or so, or certainly by tomorrow morning, take a look at your spam box, maybe check through your filters and make sure it didn't get stuck somewhere. And if for some reason it doesn't arrive, please let us know, and Libby or myself will be happy to help you with that. And I think you'll find that when this pops up, it'll be very clear, it'll be very easy walk through, and you can click that link and get your certificate. So all that really is just a long-winded introduction to ask Jesse Constantino to join the Humanities in Class webinar series. And it's I think oftentimes in teaching and learning we wind up unteaching as much as teaching, and sometimes that's content, sometimes those are the things that we teach. And I find that sometimes it's the ways in which we teach them, and I think there are mental models that we have to shift. There are ways in which we need our students and our parents and our colleagues and our administrators to understand the truly interactive ways in which we can share narrative, that we can talk about storytelling, that we can visualize very complex topics in a way that allows students of all ages to make sense of them. I think my personal goal for tonight is to really learn from Jesse exactly the ways in which the graphic novel over time, and then perhaps some very specific graphic novels can allow us to do that. And while he's a university educator and a very talented teacher in his own right, again, what we're hoping is that this will make a whole lot of sense for your middle grades or secondary classroom, and you'll find things that you can do almost immediately with your own students. So having said all that, Jesse, I'm going to unmute you. I'm going to hand you the mouse in just a moment. Jesse, are you there? Can you join us? Hello, Jesse.
Oh, hello? Hey.
Hey, there you are. Thanks for joining us tonight.
Hi.
We hear you. We hear you just fine, Jesse. I've given you the mouse, and so now you have control of the PowerPoint. As we talked about, I'm going to sort of watch the questions and find ways to insert the comments from our audience, but we would love to hear more from you about the graphic novel.
Great. Yeah, no, and thanks, Andy, for the introduction. That was really really great. And I do hope that this proves useful to many, if not all of you, and at the very least, interesting. So yeah, a couple of things by way of introduction to get us started. I thought it might be actually useful also to think about and to talk a little bit about how I came to comics. I am trained in visual culture, in film studies, and literary studies. And what's interesting about coming to comics through these other disciplines is that they they kind of all lead gravitationally toward comics. There's a kind of gravitational center that's formed at the nexus of these different textual forms, different visual forms that the comics and specifically the graphic novel takes advantage of and finds itself at the center of. And so I had been a long time, reader of comics when I was younger, and fell away from it as I got a little bit older, and was reading things that I guess now would be called graphic novels, that would be called independent comics. I thought I had sort of left comics behind and moved into this other form called the graphic novel. And it's only as I've been teaching both the graphic novel and comics more broadly that I've come to understand the place of graphic novels within comics more broadly, and to sort of wrestle a little bit with why I, at a certain point in my life, didn't really identify as a reader of comics and instead identified as a reader of graphic novels. And we'll talk a bit about this. I'll get at some of these ideas about what I think is behind my own kind of falling away and coming back to this word comics, with graphic novels somewhere in the middle there. And graphic novels, in addition to being at the nexus of sort of literary studies and film studies and visual culture studies, they also have a really important place in study of marginalized cultures. And again, I'll get to this in a little bit more depth later on. But it's something that, again, comes from my own interest, my own background. And of course, as I've noticed, as I've been teaching comics, writing about graphic novels, teaching the graphic novel, more and more people are taking the form seriously. And often some of that comes in the form of focusing exclusively on the graphic novel. There is a kind of codedness there that we'll, of course, also talk about. And please, as Andy said, feel free to ask questions as I go. I may rattle on for a little bit, but please feel free to ask questions at any point. And Andy I will field questions as I go.
Jesse, I'm actually going to ask just one quick question. I don't want to interrupt your flow for tonight and when you get into your groove, but I sort of, as I noted the way that you described your own evolution and sort of how you got here, was there any friction? Was there any resistance at the university level in academia to the kind of work that you do?
There is from some quarters, and I actually just had this conversation with students in one of my classes yesterday about this very topic. How there's a kind of code switching that happens where if I'm talking to certain colleagues that I know might be a little more resistant to talking about, say, comics, I'll tend to fall back on the term graphic novel. And again, I'll talk about why I think that is and what's important about that. But there is a little bit of pushback. And my approach these days has been to just sort of plow on, to try to ignore that as much as possible. Because I think it's inevitable that graphic novels and comics are going to be taken as seriously and have the same kind of cultural legitimacy as some of our older forms, like novels, which of course have their own history of going through the same process, film, same thing, and so on and so forth.
Sure. And so do you find yourself making the same code switching with your students, or do you just make the assumption that they sort of get it?
I assume the students get it, and they do. I find that as soon as I sort of drop the veneer, as it were, and just talk graphic novels, talk comics with them straight, it brings out the latent comic nerds. And you discover that many more of your students read graphic novels, read comics than maybe you even assume. And I've been surprised over the years, increasingly less so, but it definitely in the past I've been surprised to find the kinds of students that do regularly read graphic novels and comics.
Great, thank you so much.
Yeah. I can move forward here.
There you go.
There we go. All right, so I'm just going to give you a little bit of an outline of what I'm hoping to talk about today. And again, please interject with questions that you might have along the way. But first, I wanted to talk a little bit about this definition of graphic novels and the history of the graphic novel, where the form comes from, some assumptions that people make about the form, what the relationship is between graphic novels and comics, and where we might go with that going forward. Second, I wanted to talk about the how of graphic novels, and to think about how we actually read them, if we read them perhaps a little bit differently from how we read comics writ large, if we read them perhaps differently from novels, prose novels, and to kind of figure out if there is in fact a difference in how we actually read these things. And then lastly, I want to talk a little bit about the kind of thematic import here, the kind of takeaway. Ultimately, what is it that we read graphic novels for? Why do cartoonists make graphic novels? Why should we read them? Why should we teach them? Why should students read them? And to suggest some of my own thoughts about this, and hopefully hear from you all as well, your own thoughts. Right, so to start, right, this definition, what is a graphic novel? And so maybe to start us off, I thought I might do a little bit of a warm-up and ask you all a question, and maybe take a moment to think about this. But the question is this. So if I say the terms, number one, graphic novel, and number two, comic, how do you understand that term graphic novel differently from the word comic?
It's a great question, Jesse. We're gonna pause. You and I are gonna pause for a moment, and I'm gonna invite and encourage all of our participants tonight to weigh in on this. As a matter of fact, Matthew has already asked a similar question, maybe, which is, aside from gaining legitimacy from peers, what are the benefits of the term graphic novel? But again, maybe what you're really asking is, what is the difference? How do you imagine these two? So we're going to pause for a second and let you guys chime in. What do you think the difference is? How do you imagine that? Jesse, let's see. Phaedra is saying graphic novels might have a social critique or a commentary.
Length, indeed. Right. Adult, for sure. Yeah. Right.
Depth of content, visuals that can replace text. Nice.
Yeah, and continue to suggest things as I talk a little bit. And apologies if I feel like I'm talking over you a bit, but I think a lot of these things, a lot of the ideas and associations that many of you seem to have are ones that I share as well. The sense that the term graphic novel, or even graphic novels themselves, are perhaps more serious than comics, perhaps more adult, about more serious subjects, about bigger ideas, that there's a greater depth of thought and meaning, maybe because of the length, maybe because of who they are pitched toward, maybe because of the subject matter. And I think it does carry a lot of that. And part of what I'm going to suggest is that some of those things, in fact, are true, but many of them are sort of these nebulous, very difficult to pin down associations that we have with the term graphic novel, as a contrast to comics. And so in some ways, graphic novel is only meaningful as a term in contrast to comics. On its own, it doesn't necessarily mean a lot. Yeah, these are great ideas you all are suggesting.
Yeah, Jesse, I need to pull one of them out just to get your impression. So Kelly Davis has said that she used to work with graphic novel writers, and they said that it elevates the level. Comic books are childish. So maybe it's from both directions.
Yeah, exactly, right. And it's not just say our colleagues in the hall that have that association. It's a lot of the cartoonists themselves. It's the industry, and there are reasons why I think cartoonists have chosen, many of them at least, have chosen to self-identify as graphic novelists rather than comics creators, something like that. And you do see a lot of that back and forth for sure among creators themselves. Yeah, and so part of what I want to add to this mix, and we do have these associations, and I don't know that they're going anywhere anytime soon, right? But to also add some history here, some sort of social impact here. that might help us to more securely situate some of those associations. So the first thing I have here is this idea that maybe graphic novel as a term is caught up in marketing, right? And this is this idea that in order for comics to reach new market, new audience, that they would need to be put into bookstores, right? And in order to be put into bookstores, they would need to be bound and need to be something a little bit lengthier that might sell for a little bit more money than your typical comic book, which might go for anywhere from $3 to $4. You could sell it as a full-length book for $15 to $30, right? This was also about expanding the market, finding new readers to read comics. People that didn't identify as comics readers might perhaps pick up something called a graphic novel and just read it because maybe they know novels and it sounds something like a novel, looks something like a novel, at least on the bookshelf. So yeah, there is this marketing component for sure, right? And in fact, the first well-known artist to use this term graphic novel, Will Eisner, who I'll be coming back to, he had trouble finding a publisher for a book-length comic that he had been working on. And it went through multiple publishers, and many of them said, no, we'll pass, we don't publish comics, we just publish serious novels. And then he decided to use this term, graphic novel, and it gained traction. You all still hearing me okay? Okay.
Great, Jesse.
Okay. And the term stuck. It worked for Will Eisner. It actually got his book a publisher, and this was a traditional book publisher, and it worked. And so in that sense, again, it works as a marketing tactic and has worked historically as a marketing tactic. Many of the associations that you all made earlier with the term graphic novel, I think, suggest this idea that it perhaps is a more serious comic as well, that there is a kind of cultural legitimacy that's being lent to comics by calling them a graphic novel, that they are perhaps deeper, about more profound things, about more serious things, of course, and that they tackle bigger ideas. So it's a kind of almost like a signal, right? A signal of a kind of legitimacy. If you could imagine the difference perhaps in register in telling, say, a colleague or a family member, well, I just read the most amazing comic book, how different that sounds from saying, like, well, I just read the most amazing graphic novel, right? There is a difference in tenor there. And then lastly, and this is something I'll also be talking about in a bit, but thinking about the formal features of a graphic novel that might in fact set it apart from other comics. And this is something that is of particular interest to me as somebody who pays attention a lot to visual form and verbal form. As I move forward. All right. So one thing that we can try to establish if we're talking about the graphic novel is, of course, a history, right? And part of what I put together here is a kind of collage of different points that various historians, and comics creators, graphic novelists have all marked as possible beginning points for both the graphic novel and for comics. So do we go as far back as cave paintings? Do we look to, as in the upper right there, William Hogarth's prints that were serialized and sequential stories? Do we look to the paneling work and visual work of illuminated manuscripts from the medieval era? Or do we look to 19th century caricature and cartooning, as in the lower right there? These are all different points that people continue to summon as possible beginning points for the form. But for our purposes, I want to start at a little slightly more contemporary period and look at the middle of the 20th century, when comics, after a kind of a boom in the industry in the 1940s, 1950s, as new print methods, print technologies, cheaper print paper were coming into abundance in the middle of first the World War II, and then immediately following the war, there was an abundance of all these different print forms, including comic books. And along with that boom in print publishing, there was also a boom in young people. So that comics were caught up in the kind of push for new forms of literacy. Young people were reading comics, and this was in fact a historical reality, right? There were many young people reading comics. This became a kind of cultural touchstone in a negative way with the publication of Seduction of the Innocent by Frederick Wertham, who was a psychologist. And he very famously made a connection between kind of juvenile delinquency in the 1950s, which was a big subject at the time, and comics. And this took hold in such a profound way that entire genres of comics, including horror comics like Tales from the Crypt, were effectively stopped, canceled. EC Comics, one of the publishers of many of these crime comics and horror comics, had to find new ways of making money, and many comics publishers turned to superhero comics. But, and this is where the graphic novel really begins, I think, there were other cartoonists who went underground, who began finding other venues to publish things that were perhaps out of the mainstream, that were perhaps pitched at a more adult audience, that were about more salacious things even, a little bit more explicit in their depiction of violence and sexuality. And this really begins with Frederick Wertham's book in putting an end to mainstream comics' attention to these sort of out of the mainstream things like violence, sex, and criminality. And one of the responses from the comics industry was to institute a kind of something like in the film industry, a kind of self-censorship board, right, where there would be an approved set of standards, moral standards that comics followed. So again, there were certain cartoonists that didn't go along with this and wanted to set up their own way of doing things, and this is the birth of underground comics. Go back one here.
So let me ask you a quick question. You know, as I hear you describe this, and I think for myself and maybe for a lot of the folks in the audience, you know, it's really difficult not to see in an almost a nostalgic way certain titles and covers, and we sort of impose ourselves on this whole kind of comics world. Is part of the change that you're describing sort of this new adult theme and the marketing, that sort of thing? Is it also a function of how much things cost? You know, me taking a quarter down to the Ben Franklin to buy a comic is far different than buying a graphic novel.
Well, at this point, there wasn't a thing available called a graphic novel, right? We're just looking at that early divide, and so this was still relatively cheap, regardless of the kind of material you were buying, whether you were buying a mainstream comic or one of these underground comics. Yeah, and what starts to happen among the underground comics industry, and I've got some examples here, including Will Eisner's, you know, we might call it a first graphic novel, at least an early one, is that these needed to be sold in other places, but the subject matter was very different from mainstream comics. The subject matter was, again, kind of adult subjects. It was adult satire. On the far left here in this slide, you can see Mad Magazine, which had to call itself a magazine because it couldn't be sold as a comic according to these new standards. Harvey Kurtzman, who was the editor of Mad, also set up Help, which is where many people in the underground comic scene got their start, who would later then go on to write graphic novels, including people like R. Crumb, who we see there in Zap Comics, and of course people like Harvey Pekar, who did American Splendor, an early example of the graphic memoir, but still in a kind of single issue format before moving into that bound graphic novel form that we all know and perhaps hopefully love. But this is all happening at this time as this set of issues, the set of subject matter is all really taking form in the underground that will then lead us into the graphic novel. So here, perhaps, and I know for me, this was one of my first encounters with something that I had known as, or that I would come to know as a graphic novel for me, and that was Art Spiegelman's Mouse. The publication of Mouse was a kind of watershed moment for graphic novels. This was the moment when people who hadn't been following comics or graphic novels suddenly saw this thing called a graphic novel. Art Spiegelman's Mouse won the Pulitzer Prize in 1992. It quickly became a standard in high school classrooms. Maybe some of you have even taught it yourselves. Maybe you've read it. But for me and for many others, this was that first major encounter with this form. But Spiegelman's Mouse was originally serialized in Raw, which was a magazine for underground comics. This was something that Art Spiegelman was very much involved in, and if you have read Mouse, you will see even a particular strip that he had done originally for Raw, separate from Mouse, that he includes in Mouse. And so this is something that starts to bring into question this term graphic novel, because again, it was originally published as a serialized comic and then later anthologized as this thing called a graphic novel, right? And so thinking about that term and what it actually means, what it does, what kind of visibility it brought to the form, what kind of cultural clout it brought to the form, and that it took not just the serious subject matter of the Holocaust, but it also took binding this serialized comic into something like a graphic novel.
Jesse, one of the questions that's just come up from Paul Lynn is, he asks, is there a difference between one graphic novel and a collection of comics like Batman?
Right, and this is tough, right? Especially if you go to a bookstore and you look in the graphic novel section, you will most certainly see collected bound anthologies of superhero comics. And one way of looking at this in a kind of cynical way is to say, well, this is, you know, comics like Batman trying to capitalize on the legitimacy of other quote-unquote more serious graphic novels. But to maybe be a little bit more fair about it, not so cynical, to think about how much work that actually does for those working in the form, right? Because again, if you're looking for that new audience, what better way to capture that audience who maybe doesn't walk into a comic book store than to find a way to sell your comic in a bookstore, you know, without having to have a bunch of very loosely bound single issue comics. But one of the other consequences here is that as much as something like Mouse brought comics into the mainstream, out of simply comic fandom and into the hands of other readers, is that it also, as much as it brought a kind of legitimacy to the form as a whole, in this form of the graphic novel, it also drove a bit of a wedge between this thing called graphic novels and this other thing called comics, right? And so and this is something that I think we're still living with. We're still in the midst of that kind of cultural division where comics are seen as the lower version and graphic novels are seen as that higher version. And Mouse in many ways was as much perhaps inadvertently responsible for that as anything, because it could be seen as, again, that legitimate version of the form in contrast to the thing that people could sort of dismissively say, well, I don't read comics, I read graphic novels. So this is one of those, again, one of those watershed moments in the history of graphic novels. And one of the things that I actually tend to do in my classes, even though I do teach many graphic novels and regularly teach them, is I often, and you probably heard me do this just in this talk tonight, often use the term comics instead of the term graphic novel. And part of that is to sort of get around some of that division, that arbitrary division that seems to creep in whenever we're talking about graphic novels. So I do often use that term comics when I'm talking to my students, for sure. And this is a great thing to do with colleagues and family members as well, because again, as I suggested earlier, there is a kind of code switching that happens where when we're trying to talk about the form, in a serious way, we use this term graphic novels, but by insisting on using that term comics, it kind of challenges that a little bit and challenges that cultural stratification that can set in. And so this is something I've come to do more and more over the years. Okay. Thanks. So I now want to get into a little bit of the how of graphic novels, and in order to get at the how of graphic novels, I also have to talk about the how of comics more generally. So this is a page from Alan Moore and Dave Gibbons' Watchmen, which you may have read or you may have seen the film adaptation. But very typically, and for those of us who maybe aren't as familiar with comics and the how of comics, this can sometimes be a little bit confusing, but generally speaking, comics are read according to panels. And the panels are those boxes that go around whatever is being shown in a particular frame. And you might call them the boxes of the comics, right? They're typically referred to as panels. But we read from left to right and from top to bottom, at least in Western comics. In East Asian comics, they follow their reading practices, which go right to left and so on and so forth. But in Western comics, there is that left to right, top to bottom way of reading and way of following panels. But one thing that is interesting about the history here as well is that this is much more a legacy of magazines and of newspaper print than it is of something like a printed novel. So the rules that govern how we read a panel and move from panel to panel typically follow the same rules that we would apply to reading magazine columns or reading newspaper columns. So there is this kind of more or less standardized way of reading. However, if I can move forward, there we go. However, and this is why I had you read this Nick Souzanis excerpt, comics have this capacity to be read simultaneously as a single entity on a single page, rather than reading from panel to panel to panel to take in a full page. And there are a lot of different ways that artists and writers will do this. And in this particular page layout, you can see some examples of that. So one of the things that will happen is because certain branches connect with one another across the panels, often in a vertical alignment, you might be tempted to read vertically from top to bottom or bottom to top, rather than simply going left to right, top to bottom as that order of operations. There are other things that are governing the arrangement of this page as well that kind of challenge that normative reading order, right? And this is something that comics as a whole do all the time, that we see this kind of almost as though comics work at cross purposes, right? That there is this linear way of reading that goes from left to right, top to bottom, and then there's also this simultaneous form of reading that takes in panels in all kinds of different orders. And so to return to that page that I just showed earlier from the Watchmen, right? There's another way that we could read this. So simply reading from left to right, top to bottom, only takes us in one direction, but we can see if we pay attention to some of the formal details here, there are things working against that way of reading. So for example, looking on that left-hand column here, I've just given a few examples. So there is this angle to the sidewalk and the cracks in the sidewalk. There's this sense of a direction of that blood flow that is moving down and to the left that doesn't move in the same direction that we would read the page, right? And same with that angle in the sidewalk. There's also this sense of a changing perspective, as though we're looking through a camera and zooming out, that is also challenging the direction of reading as we would ordinarily apply it. And then we see that vanishing point that goes again down and to the left, that moves against that left to right movement. That is again challenging that way that we might ordinarily read the page. Similarly, and I put some color transitions. And again, these are just examples of ways you might talk about reading simultaneously, or at least reading counter to that reading order. When you look at the color transitions and that moving red to that sort of pinkish salmon color to a kind of gray blue, and then to that very harsh transition of the figure in the lower right with the purplish hair and that brown jacket. Even in those color arrangements, you see what looks to be a kind of smooth, gradual transition from top to bottom, and then you get that harsh sort of punctuation mark at the end of the page or at the bottom of the page. That, again, in order to understand that, you have to read that in a way that doesn't follow just that strict left to right, top to bottom way that we might read written text or printed text.
It's almost a close reading pedagogy as you look at this, Jesse. It's really
Absolutely.
The slides. So one question that occurs to me, because I can see this visually right now, but Chris asks, how much has cinema affected this sort of graphic novel authoring? I mean, is there a cinematic piece to this as well?
I think there is, and part of that is, as I mentioned at the beginning, I have a film background, film studies background, and so I see it everywhere. But definitely in talking to people who make comics, and then people who write about comics and teach comics, they all use cinematic language. They talk about things like establishing shots. They talk about things like a zooming out, as here on this page. They talk about things like reverse shot structures. Sometimes they'll even just talk about shots and the arrangement of shots when actually they're talking about panels. So you see a lot of that slippage happening among producers of comics, among scholars of comics, among teachers of comics all the time, for sure. And I think something about the graphic novel seems to lend itself to that cinematic form, partly because of all the reasons we've been talking about, that association with a kind of cultural legitimacy, an association with a kind of depth, an association with all of those things that we often, now at least, associate with filmmaking. So I mentioned, and you all know this, but I had you all read Scott McCloud, at least a chapter from Scott McCloud, in addition to that Nick Susanna's chapter. And this was a section from McCloud on panel transitions. And this is something that I often will use in my classes. I regularly will show these charts, have my students do charts like this, sometimes for just a few pages, sometimes for just one page, sometimes for a full-length graphic novel or comic. And it's a really useful exercise, for sure. It gets them thinking a lot about how these transitions work, to what effect, why there are so many of one kind of transition, why so few of another, why one particular graphic novel will seem to use a lot more of one kind than another. But something else that I really like about this approach that McCloud has is the way that he is willing to generalize, right? To kind of paint with a broad brush. And that's tempting for me to do as well. And so I started thinking, and maybe this is a good question to ask you all, if you can imagine what kinds of transitions are more common in graphic novels than, say, in comics at large. So I don't know if you have any guesses. I have my own sort of predictions and measurements, but I'm curious what you all think.
That's a good way to pause for a moment, and we'll see if our audience, our participants, can chime in on that answer. There's been a very active chat box so far. Paul Lyon asks if you can repeat that question.
Yeah, well, I'm curious if you think or can guess at what kinds of transitions dominate in graphic novels in contrast to comics, more generally.
Flashback and flash forward. Words like meanwhile are used in comics, in conjunctions, bigger art, Paul suggests. Matthew even sort of earlier in the chat asks, why should we care about these transitions?
Mm-hmm. These are all really good questions. So maybe I'll start with that last question first, why we should care. Number one, as a scholar, this can tell us a lot about how a particular graphic novel understands temporality, understands spatial relationships, understands thematic relationships. Because as McCloud talks about, there's this idea of closure that we as readers are constantly engaging in as we fill in the gaps in time and space between panels, that we're doing in all these different ways. And these 6 different transitions, I think, are a really useful way to think about that, or at least to categorize that. Something that I've noticed, and this would take, I think, a much broader study than what I have engaged in myself, but something that I have noticed in graphic novels is that they tend to use that 3, 4, and 5 transition, right? Subject to subject, scene to scene, aspect to aspect. Whereas many mainstream comics in particular, say superhero comics, tend to fall in that 2, 3, 4 category, which is a subtle difference, but I think it has everything to do with the way in which comics that aren't graphic novels rely a lot more on action and conveying and communicating action. Graphic novels rely much more on character, on theme, on suggesting a kind of spatial and temporal relationship that's much more complex than most action comics. And that's not to say that graphic novels are more complex than action comics, but to say that their relationship to character and to theme is often much more complex. And so that's something that I've noticed. But again, it would require, I think, a much broader study, right? Much broader data set. But it's something that would be, I think, a great exercise in classrooms. And to have students do that, they could even do that kind of comparative work. So this is something that I find really useful myself, and so hopefully you would as well. There are other interesting qualities I've noticed as well about graphic novels that relate, I think, to these panel transitions, which is that often graphic novelists rely on much more static, grid-like panel layouts than many other comics artists. Other comics artists, and I'll show you some examples here in a second, tend to use things like overlapping panels, different panel shapes, unusual and experimental panel layouts, whereas graphic novelists often will just follow a very predictable, regularized panel layout that looks much more grid-like. And I think there are good reasons for that. Some of that might have to do with an emphasis on character over action, emphasis on theme over fast-moving pacing, and so on and so forth. So here, what I wanted to show you was some of these differences in the other things, the other stuff of graphic novels, which is the kind of title page information, the use of introductions, and introductions are oftentimes written by established prose novelists. And so there's this, again, a kind of cultivation of cultural legitimacy to graphic novels, as you see over there on the right. On the left, I have the other matter that's often included in single-issue comics, where you get advertisements, you get letters pages. Even the title page for most single-issue comics tends to be much busier. It includes a very quick and short summary of the story so far, just to get you straight into the action. But even all of this peripheral matter between single-issue comics and graphic novels tends to be rather different. And on the graphic novel side, tends to look a lot more like what we would think of as that traditional prose novel. Go. And here is this idea of closure, right? And this is why I'm including this page from McLeod, just to remind us of exactly how this works, right? And McLeod talks about this in this chapter as basically all of the work that we do between panels as readers, right? That there's a lot happening between panels that doesn't actually go articulated, but nevertheless we understood to have happened, right? And so, of course, a graphic novel is not a prose novel, despite some of those resemblances that I was showing in that prior slide. But I think one of those ways in which graphic novels distinguish themselves and retain their comicsness is in this idea of closure, right? Is in this idea of the things that are happening that aren't actually drawn, which is fascinating to me, right? That what makes graphic novels and even comics more broadly so distinct is what they don't do, what they don't show. But it's the how of how they don't show things, the how of what they don't do, that makes them so powerful and so meaningful, which is, I think, perhaps unexpected for people that aren't used to dealing with comics. And so what this suggests to me is actually what makes graphic novels distinctive, what makes them unique in contrast to prose novels, isn't really their use of images. It's actually this closure effect. It's this way in which time and space can be compacted and expanded in really radical ways between panels in the gutter, as it were. So here I wanted to show, as a kind of point of contrast, a typical graphic novel layout against a typical single issue comic layout. So here I've got a page from Persepolis, which some of you may have read, or you may have seen the film adaptation. And then on the right, I've got a page from a Spider-Man comic, a recent Spider-Man comic. And here you can see part of what I was getting at before, where I was suggesting that graphic novels tend to follow a much more regularized, predictable, grid-like panel structure, whereas you see the very busy page layouts of single-issue comics. And there are a lot of reasons for this, but I think a lot of it has to do with the emphasis on pacing, on action that happens in single-issue comics that doesn't necessarily happen in graphic novels. And in graphic novels, I think the emphasis is much more on character, on facial expression, on thematic relationships between panels. And in this example, you can see a lot more of those subject-to-subject transitions between panels in contrast to the action-to-action panel relationships in the single-issue comic. Oftentimes, because graphic novels are a kind of descendant of underground comics, they are produced by a single writer who is also the artist, who is also the editor. In contrast, in single issue comics, you tend to see a much more complex division of labor, where you have a single writer, sometimes two writers. You have a single artist, sometimes two artists, divided into the person doing penciling and another person doing inking. And then you have another person doing coloring, and then you have another person doing editing, and so on and so forth. Whereas in the graphic novel, you have this emphasis on the single creator, who is often that single person whose singular voice is being portrayed on the page, right? And so again, you might think about the ways in which this is really drawn from that underground comics tradition, rather than this other branch of comics, which is much more on that action end, right? Even the panel borders in the graphic novel example here are hand-drawn, whereas the panel borders in the single issue comic are computer assisted. They're intensely regular. They're almost look machine-like in their regularity, or at least in their exactness. And you see a lot of this happening over and over and over again. And there's very often an emphasis on the artist's hand, right, in graphic novels, even to the level of doing the lettering. It's the same person doing the lettering, whereas in many single-issue comics, particularly these days, it's done by computer. Even though you have somebody who's thinking very much about design and fonts and everything else, they are not handwriting the lettering in the way that often graphic novelists are. I see a really good question over here, actually. I just want to step in because
yeah, please do.
If graphic novels grow in popularity, will the labor see a division like the single issue comic? It's a really interesting question. I wish I had an answer, but I have started to see some of this happening, where people who, like Brian Lee O'Malley, who did Scott Pilgrim, he recently has recruited colorists to add coloring to his graphic novels, because coloring is a really time-consuming process, and very few dedicated graphic novelists know how or even have the time or money to do coloring. And so I've started to see more people including colorists in their work in graphic novels, and so that maybe is already happening. And so what I wanted to show here is that this isn't all just a one-way thing where graphic novels are borrowing from the form of the novel, borrowing from the form of mainstream comics. But novels as well, prose novels, are also often borrowing from the layout principles, the paneling principles even, of comics. You may know some of these. Danielewski's House of Leaves has many, many comics-like layouts. It almost reads like a graphic novel in places. Arno Schmidt's recently translated Bottom's Dream. Salvador Plasencia's The People of Paper has a lot of the same kinds of layout principles that are shared in common between magazines, comics, graphic novels, etc. And then Jennifer Egan's PowerPoint, which is very appropriate considering what we're doing right now. Her PowerPoint chapter from A Visit from the Goon Squad, which again follows a lot of the same paneling principles as graphic novels and comics. And I thought I would maybe pause here to see if there are any other questions. I'm going to move into a kind of final section here, but any questions at this point?
Yeah, I think it's interesting to see Jennifer comment, Jennifer from New Jersey comment on the ways in which her students sometimes struggle with this concept of structure and how it undergirds what they read. But these kinds of comparisons really does allow them to see that in both print text as well. Do you find that as you work with older students, with your university students, that those same kinds of things reveal?
Absolutely. One of the most productive exercises I've actually done in my comics classes and in my graphic novel classes is having them put together a panel layout. And I don't have them do, they don't have to draw figures, they don't have to draw even action. They just simply have to draw the panel borders themselves on a full page layout and describe what they would draw if they were going to fill in those panels. And how the panel structure, how those panel layouts would help them to communicate what's happening. And to think about how a reader's eye might move across the page differently with different panel sizes, different panel arrangements, versus other possibilities. And I do a lot of that work, and that helps to communicate that role of structure, because they very clearly see from the ground up as the page is being built how hard it is, actually. That was one of the biggest takeaways for them. They realized just how difficult it is just to do a seemingly simple thing like draw boxes. And that's been really, really helpful for me with my students. All right. So to get to our final section here, so and I guess I can throw this question at you as well. I'm thinking about what graphic novels are actually for, right? And this is the question maybe I'll give you all as this first question here. Do we need graphic novels if we already have both comics and novels? If graphic novels are simply combining those two forms, what are they actually contributing that is new and important to our lives, to our reading practice even?
We'll see what folks have to say. I think Claudia is a good question. I'm going to try to bring up a little bit later, Claudia and Jesse, which is how technology is affecting this form, but let's see if folks can respond to these lead questions. Paul thinks they might not be mutually exclusive.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, Liliana definitely points at the differentiation that graphic and novels and comics allow.
That's great. Yeah, I mean, why not try everything, right? This is sort of my attitude, right? The more forms, the better. I have some sort of takeaways that I think graphic novels actually do contribute that is unique and special to the form, but in some ways I almost kind of don't care, right? It's like the more the merrier. The more different ways people have of expressing themselves, the better. And the more different ways people have of then reading or viewing these things, the better. And it sounds like, judging by a handful of your answers, you found this to be the case in your classrooms, or at least in even your personal lives. Like, why not, right? And some of these bigger questions, and these are almost rhetorical questions, but I will try to answer them to some degree here in a minute. But thinking about this idea that we may, as teachers, as scholars of this form, are we always going to have to justify it, right? Are we always going to be on the defense and trying to justify that legitimacy of graphic novels or of comics? And I don't know. And I know that among other scholars of graphic novels and comics, many of them have just given up this idea of trying to defend the form anymore. To defending them to colleagues, defending them to even students. I've had, in the past, some students who are like, well, why are we reading a graphic novel in this class? I thought this was a literature class. Things like this. I've gone back and forth, and I know that, as I said, sort of colleagues of mine have just decided outright just to stop addressing this idea. But for me, I think it's actually a really central concept to the graphic novel. So if we go back to something like the underground comic scene, that grew out of this question of legitimacy, right? So if you remember back to what I was saying about the introduction of the comics code and the ways in which comics split in two directions. They went on the one hand toward children-friendly action comics, and on the other side they went to this much more explicit, adult-oriented and graphic version of underground comics. And so this question of legitimacy is really at the beginning of graphic novels, right? And I think there are good payoffs for that I'll get to here in just a second, that I think come from us as teachers and readers and scholars, and also from cartoonists themselves embracing that illegitimacy of the form, rather than trying to sort of do this endless defensive work of legitimizing the form, instead embracing its illegitimacy. So I have here a few examples of some well-known recent graphic novels. Fun Home is probably the most famous of the bunch. March, of course. This one Summer. Most of these have won awards. My favorite thing is Monsters. I'm actually teaching right now this week. These are all examples of graphic novels that are dealing with questions of cultural legitimacy of its subjects. And this is what's fascinating to me. So if the form itself of the graphic novel has found itself having to do this kind of acrobatic work of legitimizing the form, it's many cartoonists have used that as an opportunity to talk about types of identities, types of stories that are also treated this way, that are also often delegitimized, that are often made to seem less important, marginal, etc. And this is something that has exploded in the form. And in some ways, what people know about graphic novels is exactly this, that they are a way of voicing the experience of the marginalized. And in this way, this might be one of those answers to that question, why do we need the graphic novel rather than just comics or novels? It's because they seem to do this really, really well. And so similar to young adult fiction, YA fiction that some of you may read yourselves or perhaps you even teach, much like YA fiction, this question of legitimacy is the reason the form has become this go-to for marginalized identities in the first place. So if the form had unquestioned legitimacy, it's maybe unlikely that marginalized groups would rally around it so strongly and so consistently. And it's been fascinating to see this take shape, really in the wake of Mouse, I think, more than anything else. But as I've tried to show here, there is a history here that goes back to the underground comic scene. And I think that's why there is this kind of almost continuity from underground comics into the graphic novel. One other possible way of answering this question, too, of why the graphic novel, is that graphic novels also do really well in tackling otherwise inexpressible historical and political situations. So graphic novels have become a really common form for talking about traumatic histories, traumatic political events happening around the world, military events, extreme violence happening in certain places. And again, I think it has to do with this question of legitimacy. So graphic novels have found themselves a kind of go-to form, not just for legitimizing certain marginalized identities, but also of legitimizing certain histories that might otherwise go unacknowledged, unexpressed, unprocessed. And so you see trauma being worked through quite a bit. And thinking about why this is, I think is really what makes the graphic novel so endlessly fruitful for me, both as a scholar and as a teacher, and a reason why I continue to go back to it. So what I wanted to include here is a short passage from Hilary Schute's book. This is all about the relationship between graphic novels and trauma, historical trauma. And this is just a brief passage. I'll read this, but hopefully you can hear some of what I'm talking about in her language and what she's talking about here. So from 19th century engraved novels to newspaper comic strips, wordless novels to print culture-obsessed word and image fantasies, mass comic books to radical left comics commentary, short modernist compositions to darkly political satire, each exhibits a formal vocabulary, however distinct, that connects comics to the practice and possibility of witness, to the expression of realities of lived life and history. One sees this in the profound proliferation of time and multiplication of space in comics, in its refusal of linearity and regularity in its narrative movement. One also sees this in its immediacy-provoking insistent positioning of the body, whether reflexively through the mark itself or through the location of bodies in time and space on the page. And significantly, one sees this in comics' awareness of its own properties, which constantly marks attention to the acts of spectating and perception, both within and outside the frame. And Hilary Shute is one of these people that I suggested before had sort of given up on trying to defend the legitimacy of the form. And so you see her using the term comics rather than graphic novel. But if you actually go to the book, the examples that she draws from are those things that I think many of us would probably assume are graphic novels rather than sort of comics writ broadly, right? But she's, again, one of these people I think who justifiably digs down deep and just uses that term comics rather than graphic novels. But I love this passage, and that to me really speaks to the promise of the form and why it has very rapidly, I think, taken root as a way of talking about historical trauma, personal trauma, and questions of legitimacy, but not necessarily always legitimacy of the form, but legitimacy of personhood, legitimacy of politics, legitimacy of identity. All right. So just to wrap up with some ideas, and again, please, if you have questions, continue to ask them because I want to keep this conversation going. But by way of conclusion, just a couple of really important ideas that were takeaways for me in putting this together, and that I hope that you all walk away from this session at least recognizing. So that the term graphic novel is both, at least to my eye, both arbitrary and meaningful, right? And what I mean by that is that the graphic novel as a term often comes from things that are not really definitive, not necessarily super concrete if we're trying to separate the graphic novel from other types of comics. So there's this kind of arbitrariness, right, that often has to do with lending it a kind of cultural clout, right? But at the same time, there is, as we've seen, I hope at least, real meaning there. There is actual payoff to using this term graphic novel and to singling out the graphic novel from other kinds of comics that I do believe has a real payoff. And in a related way, I mean, the graphic novel as a form is in constant flux, and its meaning is constantly being renegotiated by readers, by us as teachers, and scholars, by creators, and by publishers. And this has to do with the way in which graphic novels are marketed, the way in which they're produced, the way in which they're read, the way in which they're taught. One of the common things that I will tell my students when I'm teaching graphic novels and comics is that the thing that defines the form more than anything else, not just graphic novels, but comics more broadly, is that we're always having to relearn how to read them. There is very little stability in the how of reading graphic novels and comics, and the same holds true for how this word graphic novel is used to define certain kinds of comics and not others. That again has this both arbitrary and meaningful impact. The third idea is that the graphic novel is a form that combines that simultaneous reading practice of comics with the linear reading practice of novels. And I think this has to do with, again, maybe some of that more regularized paneling and layouts of graphic novels in contrast to some single issue comics. That makes it read in a perhaps more linear way than other kinds of comics do. But at the same time, it still retains this approach of both reading and producing them that is simultaneous, right? If we read a full page, we may not read in that left to right, top to bottom order. And it sounds like a semantic thing, right, to talk about, well, what order you read the panels in, except that it can often have a really dramatic impact on the takeaway in terms of character development. And if we're talking about regularly marginalized identities and people, that can actually play out in really dramatic ways on the page. Number four, and directly related idea, right? The legitimacy of graphic novels as a literary form, and I do mean that that graphic novels are in fact a literary form, is tied directly to the social and political legitimacy of its subjects, right? So that the reason that certain groups and certain people find such power in graphic novels, I think has everything to do with this questionable legitimacy of the form. And so I think that looseness is really important. That marginal space for the form is really important for different groups that identify themselves as marginalized people. And then finally, this idea of trauma, right? That graphic novels give new flexible expression to otherwise inexpressible historical and personal traumas, right? That graphic novels actually give us a new way of expressing the world, reading about the world, teaching about the world, studying the world, that isn't available in other forms. And I think people that are really using the graphic novel to talk about historical trauma and political violence take that very seriously. That this is a form that needs to do that, that can do that, and does it perhaps better than others. Yeah, and that is it.
Well,
Yeah.
we do have a few questions for you, Jesse, and I want to add this question as a way to extend your last point, I think, and it comes from Shamara Moore, who asks, how do you think graphic novels can be used in activism? It seems that comics are have more of a seedy history in this regard than graphic novels.
Huh, that's fascinating. The wife and daughter of Art Spiegelman have actually been very involved in putting together a collection of feminist comics and handing them out as a newspaper form. First of all, at the big rally that was in Washington over this past year, and see that expression through both graphic novels and comics as vital to sort of social justice, to questions of, again, legitimacy, to expressing the otherwise inexpressible, to finding these new forms to say things that perhaps might not have other outlets. So it's been really fascinating to see this unfolding in a particular political moment, right? To see that graphic novels and comics both have become very, very common ways of very quickly and very rapidly responding to social and political situations as they unfold.
That's a great point. Jesse, do you notice that there's any geography to what you've described tonight? In other words, is there a landscape in which graphic novels seem to be more relevant? Is it a what's it like in other countries? What's it like? Is there an urban-rural divide? Is there a north-south, east-west divide? Or is it just a ubiquitous tool that gets to the point of the things that you've asked?
it's interesting to see the sort of the global comics community and global graphic novelist community come together around certain ideas. So, for example, one of the things you may have noticed in the collage I put together of different works addressing historical trauma, how many of those are coming out of the Muslim world. It's I think reflective of where we are globally in terms of our political investments, in terms of our focus militarily, and I mean collectively at its broadest sense, right? Globally, those of us who are living in this world, that there are certain places that come to be flashpoints for graphic novels, just as they are flashpoints for world events. Part of this might be, in fact, the rapidity with which cartoonists can respond to world events, in contrast to, say, a prose novelist. And even graphic novelists can respond very quickly. And so there's a closeness there with simply news, right? It's not a coincidence that comics themselves grow out of those same print forms that are associated with spreading the news, right? Whether we're talking about newspapers or magazines, that nearness to present events and things that are unfolding in our present moment make their way into graphic novels very, very quickly.
Yeah, it actually reminds me of a webinar we did a few weeks ago with Ellen McLarney, who's a historian at Duke, and she focused in her 90 minutes on the ways in which graffiti and art and graphic novels actually were used in the Arab Spring, and the ways that was a way to communicate that community that you just referenced. We've got a couple of questions come here. Dominic asks, it's the last question there for you to read as well, Jesse. Can we very quickly touch on Susanna's reading and embodiment? I have to admit, I'm not quite sure what that is. Jesse, does that ring a bell?
It does to me, actually. Well, thinking about, I think that's the combination there of the Susanna's reading and of the Hilary Shute reading, where she's talking about the role of bodies. Something that I think is really vital to the way that graphic novels work, in contrast to other comics forms, is this emphasis on the subject-to-subject transition, which I think, if we're talking about panel transitions, what that means is, if we look at that panel-to-panel detail, we'll see a lot of emphasis on bodies and faces, and not necessarily doing anything, but perhaps expressing certain emotions or being shown in a close-up, saying or thinking a particular thing. And so that the body is really brought forward in that way. And this is something that Hilary Shute also believes very strongly. And actually right now in my own class, when I'm teaching My Favorite Thing Is Monsters, I'm talking about blocking. And by blocking, I mean it in the theatrical sense, right? Where certain figures and bodies stand with respect to others. And this is something that becomes really important in a graphic novel form, visually, in a way that I don't think is as true in other comics forms, and certainly not in prose novels. You can't really deal with embodiment in the same way. It's a very different subject. So yeah, I mean, I think it's something that is definitely a useful concept to, number one, think about while we read graphic novels, but number two, to teach and to get students to talk about as well.
Fader has asked whether or not, Jesse, you're aware of any graphic novel contests for older students in particular. Maybe you have some at the college level that she could be aware of, but it doesn't seem, according to her, that there are many essay and poetry contests, but not too many for this genre. Do you have any sense of that? I
don't. That is really, like, I'm actually kind of surprised to hear that, and only because I hadn't really thought of it. And I don't want to say that it's not true that there aren't such contests, but I don't know of any off the top of my head. Go ahead and start one. I mean, if you have the money. Yeah, I don't know of any, unfortunately.
Yeah, and of course, and Sarah Arnold, who's one of our Teachers Advisory Council members, Sarah's in Wisconsin, also notes this question of whether or not there's literary merit in the eyes of College Board, or if graphic novels, as they become more of a common tool, reach into environments like that.
I personally think it's inevitable. I don't know on the policy level sort of what's happening, but I do think it's inevitable. I think just having seen this this form take root in such a strong, powerful way at the college level. And I do have good friends who are secondary school teachers, and judging from you all as well, that graphic novels are becoming not necessarily standard, but more common in curriculum design. I can't speak for the College Board, though, unfortunately, but I do think it's inevitable.
Jesse, tell me this. Given all of your work that you've done, and Matthew, by the way, just put a link there that might answer some of that question. But given all the work that you've done, tell us a disadvantage, or tell us one sort of shortcoming that you find in the graphic novel.
It's on the teaching level, honestly. Like as a scholar, I don't really come across many shortcomings, but teaching, it can be sometimes challenging to convince students to take them seriously as well. Just as I've suggested, sometimes comics and graphic novels are not always taken seriously by my colleagues or by family members. Students don't always as well. And so it really takes that hard work. I think if you're doing the kind of structural analysis, that can often help to persuade students what these things are like from the ground up, how they're actually put together, the amount of thought that goes into it, the logical work that happens between panel transitions, the enormous amount of thought that goes into not just the writing of comics, but the visual construction of them. And so in some ways, I see that as my work as a teacher when I do this. I know certain students are going to be on board right away, but there are other students that will either sort of passively push back, I guess is the best way to put it, where they maybe won't do the reading or won't speak up because they think it's not a subject that's worth as much of their attention. So it really does take that bottom-up kind of building of what they should understand about the form.
Yeah, that makes sense. Jesse, we're almost out of time, but I have one last question for you, and it's a little bit of a context to this question. Currently at the National Humanities Center, we have a national campaign that we call the Humanities Moments campaign, and it's intended to be a sort of a crowdsourced digital project in which stakeholders and people in our community all over the country of all different backgrounds identify and then contribute a moment in their past in which the humanities allowed them or helped them make sense of it. You know, there was an epiphany, there's a time in which something just helped it all click together. And so I'm always interested, particularly in the work that you do. This seems like a nice way to end tonight's conversation. There must have been, back in the life of Jesse, there must have been that moment when, you know, some comic or graphic novel was in your hand. I don't mean the one that you teach now or the one that you might suggest is the most appropriate as a scholar, but what was that one comic that really just got you? Where was that cusp for you?
It's kind of an hilarious answer. I immediately have an answer to that.
Good.
And it's funny, I've never really thought about this, but you just describing it that way, I have an immediate answer, which is a graphic novel of the Smurfs. And it was the story of Astro Smurf. Some of you may know this. There's a cartoon adaptation, but the original graphic novel, which I didn't think of as a graphic novel at the time. I thought of it as just a storybook that I was reading as a child, but it had this dramatic impact on me because the story is all about this dreaming Astro Smurf who wants to go to Mars, and he builds a rocket and it doesn't work. And the rest of the Smurfs are, you know, really bummed out for him, and so they want to help him, and so what they end up doing is convincing him to try again. He tries again, they drug him, and he passes out, and they rebuild a sort of false recreation of Mars. And they dress up as Martians, and they persuade him that he has in fact landed on Mars. And something about that just stuck in a profound way. So whenever I encounter what seemed to me like these really profound moments of insight into the world, you know, if I'm doing, you know, really elaborate like Marxist ideology critique or something like that, I can't help but think of that experience of what it means to construct this false world and to see kind of the artifice that goes into how we understand the world, how we respond to the world. There's something about that particular story that just has always stuck. And it's both a frightening idea that, you know, maybe the people around me are supporting a false vision of the world, and it's also a really enlightening idea, right? That maybe there's more to be seen than what's immediately presented to me. And that's been kind of a formative comic. I know it sounds really strange, but I probably read it when I was 5 or 6, and I've always kept a copy of it around because it really is just one of these profound texts for me. Absolutely.
Yeah. I really appreciate that answer. I would invite you to go to humanitiesmoments.org and upload that moment. I think it would be a fantastic contribution to our collection. But I think it's also a reminder of how comics and graphic novels, particularly for younger students, can really help give an entry point into these really complex connections of the human experience. And in some ways, it's really a beautiful answer that it's the Smurfs. It may not help you with that credibility you talked about, but it's a great answer. So, Jesse, I cannot thank you enough for joining us tonight. We really appreciate you spending your evening with us. Jesse, thank you so much.
Thanks, Andy, and thanks, everybody.
I want to thank all of our participants tonight for joining us and for contributing to the conversation. Again, this is a recorded session, and usually within 48 hours or so, it will be on our National Humanities Center YouTube channel. And you can go back and revisit the conversation, match it up against the PowerPoint, and hopefully find ways to extend this work and this conversation into your own teaching. We very much encourage you to join us for all of our professional development work. That includes our virtual sessions like this webinar series, as well as some face-to-face work that we do, including summer institutes. You can see all the updated registration pages and the announcements and all the different work that we do, mostly through social media. That's probably the best way now to really keep track of our constantly evolving and ongoing work. I also want to remind you to do the evaluation tonight. When you exit this training, an evaluation is going to pop up in your browser, so you complete it. We love your feedback. And then once that's completed, a certificate's going to be emailed to you, usually within an hour or so after you complete that evaluation. This is a change from previous years, by the way, so just take a moment to be intentional about that process, and it all should work pretty seamlessly. The recordings themselves, again, are on YouTube, and we would encourage you to not only look at tonight's, but maybe find some other webinars from the past that have something to do with this kind of topic, and that includes the one we did just a few weeks ago on the Arab Spring, in which that scholar talked quite a bit about the use of art and graffiti and graphic novels in that context. Our next webinar is next Tuesday. It's Election Day. It's also, unfortunately, a sold-out webinar. We'll be working with Mike Clairman, who's a professor of law at Harvard University on the Supreme Court and civil rights. If you've signed up, it's really going to be an absolutely fantastic session. Mike's a great speaker, and he's one of the country's leading legal scholars on the Supreme Court and civil rights. This is also a reminder to you, though, to check out the rest of our fall and spring offerings. Our numbers are really going up all the time, and so if you see something that interests you and you feel pretty good about the ability to join us, please go ahead and sign up and register. Don't register if you know you can't be there, because that'll take a slot from somebody else, but please go through nationalhumanities.org/webinars and identify those that would be good fits for you. Thanks again for joining us. Have a great day at school tomorrow, and we'll see you next time with the Humanities in Class webinar series. Good night.